And we were started in the 80s during the farm crisis. And from the beginning, we've been very involved. And in fact, we started with the assistance of Farm Aid. But really, our mission is to help keep family farmers on the land. And so, over the past several decades, that has meant a lot of work on lending law, on discrimination issues, and as relevant today, and which Stephen will speak to more shortly, a lot of work on various disaster programs and disaster relief. And so we work primarily by coordinating and working with other organizations who have farmer members, and we really try to just get the most detailed information that we can out there. So for us, creating a summarized version of disaster assistance is a bit of a challenge, given many of our guides are sometimes hundreds of pages long with lots of footnotes. So, but we are very happy to be here and hope that this will be a useful hour and a half for folks. I do want to say we are anticipating plenty of time at the end for questions. But that said, because there are so many different programs and kind of subtopics that we're going to be going through, if you do have questions along the way, please feel free to put those questions in the chat. And I think as Stephen is sort of presenting, I'll be doing my best to watch the chat for questions. And if there's something that you are just very eager to ask, we are not offended if you interrupt us. So we definitely want this to be useful for everyone who's here. So you can help to create that. And with that, I think I will turn it over to Stephen.
Hey everybody, it's really great to be with you. Before we sort of get going full steam, it maybe is worth mentioning that Flag has worked for a very long time on farm disaster issues. Our first disaster guide was in 1993, and it was in response to the massive flooding in the Midwest. I remember that every county in Iowa was a declared disaster area, and we started trying to figure out, okay, what's really available for people, and we realized that there was no single place where farmers could go to even briefly figure out what in the world was going on in terms of programs. So we decided to try to write one and thought, oh, this should be simple. But of course wasn't. But we've been working on disaster stuff ever since. And so when we get going with our guide draft, you'll see that it's labeled actually draft. So we're really hoping that you won't share this kind of outside of your own use. It's a it's pretty close, but we have some things that we want to check and maybe add. And so we're hoping that it doesn't get leak out into the world. So just because we don't want people relying on something that we don't feel 100% confident about. So it's perfectly good for our purposes today, but please don't, distribute it widely to people who would depend on it. So with that said, we're going to do a couple things. One, I'm going to talk a little bit about some introductory issues about kind of the way to think about disaster assistance for farmers. Then we're going to work through our short little condensed guide, and it's a very boiled down, and Lindsay and I are going to kind of flip-flop talking about the programs, and there are a lot of them. And the thing that I would emphasize off the top is that there is no reason to try to memorize any of the stuff that we'll talk about or what's in the guide and these various programs. Our hope here is that become familiar with the types of things that are available and the agencies that are kind of involved and where to look for certain kinds of things and really what does qualify for disaster assistance. So uh, bear with us. We're gonna really scoot through these fairly quickly. There are a lot of them. But first, let's talk about disaster things, sort of in general for farmers. The and again, feel free to ask questions in the chat or to interrupt. Um, for a very long time, there's really no such thing as disaster programs for farmers. Then you had the advent of crop insurance, which sort of helped in some ways, and slowly over the years, things got added. Um, and so what we have now is really a bit of a mix and match. You shouldn't even call it a system because I feel certain that the left hand does not understand what the right hand is doing oftentimes. But we do have a collection of programs that are designed to help people and some of them to help farmers in particular. And if they're just designed to help people, farmers are people. So that's a part of the ball game here. Um, Before we even get into the programs, it's worth saying that one thing that we're not going to talk about today is sort of the mental health aspect of the circumstances when farmers experience disasters. It's a stressful way to kind of make your life, and for some farmers, a lot more stressful than others. The stress doesn't come even on for everybody, but when you're in a natural disaster, things get generally really ramped up, and we want to remind everybody that there is, mental health assistance available. And actually, I'll just say from my own experience, working with people that are involved in a natural disaster means that you should probably do a little bit of training and checking in yourself. You do a lot of this stuff, and it can inevitably affects you as well. So let's talk about these programs be in general before we really go through boom, boom, boom and talk about them in particular. It is, as we said, a mishmash. There are USDA programs and a number of different USDA agencies that I'll say again, the right hand may not know what the left hand is doing, but USDA is very much involved. One of the things that you'll find about disaster assistance is just because you have, say, a USDA person who's super knowledgeable about their own programs, they won't really understand FEMA or any of the other organizations and the other benefits. And that's true for all of them. And it's why, we think that some sort of brief summary is really helpful to people because if you go to FEMA or to Small Business Associate Administration, they're not going to have any idea what FSA does, for example. So it's important to know that there are these different agencies involved, but also important to know that they don't know what each other are doing. So you've got USDA, FEMA, and we're not going to talk about the fact that part of FEMA is shut down today. Presumably that will not last forever. But increasingly, it feels like government programs are subject to partial or complete shutdowns. And so we'll just note that and move right along with the expectation that FEMA, when you do have to deal with a disaster, will exist and be there. There are also Small Business Administration. Weirdly enough, the Treasury Department is going to be involved in what we're talking about, as is a disaster unemployment program, which actually, for the most part, is actually run by state and tribal unemployment agencies. And, there are state programs available as well, which we're not going to talk about because that would be a long, long presentation. We're also going to talk briefly about private insurance. That will kind of come at the end. And also just the everyday functioning of law is sort of a backdrop here. So, what kind of disasters are we talking about? It's worth thinking just for a second the scope of disasters and how they actually vary in a really brief way. And I'm just going to go through some, and I think they divide fairly cleanly between sort of shorter term catastrophic events that have very long lasting effects. But then also there are things that sort of happen slow and steady and can creep up on you. So in the catastrophic events that can affect farmers and affect them significantly, you have floods, hurricanes, and with hurricane programs, you really are talking generally about the damage of the storm itself, tornadoes, blizzards, fires, um, all are sort of catastrophic events with long-term um, effects. In terms of the economic losses, actually, the biggest natural disaster usually for farmers is drought. And so you don't have this sort of single moment of destruction. It just happens day to day, week to week, and the effects can be devastating. What we're not talking about, however, in general, are things that are sort of human created, unless, of course, you want to. I mean, we're not going to talk about climate change, but we're just going to say that things where there's been some sort of human action or neglect that causes a fire or causes other problems that feel disastrous, that's not necessarily and likely won't be covered by a disaster program. Similarly, most types of disease really aren't going to be thought of as creating a disaster program. There's some overlap here. There's a program tucked in there that also helps with predation by wild animals. So you have a little bit of interaction with disease and or other sort of aspects of nature. Mad cow disease and whatnot comes to mind. But mainly disease is unless it's caused by the disaster itself, is not what we have in mind here. So, those are the happy list of disasters. There are a couple of things that we wanted to mention first of all that sort of apply to all the programs and kind of get that out of the way so we don't mention it every single time. There are two of those. One is what's going on with USDA and other federal programs right now regarding, what in society generally you would call affirmative action, but with USDA programs, you would be talking about socially disadvantaged applicants or SDA. And to just really summarize this issue and how it affects disaster and other programs, it's worth pointing out that USDA has often had programs that discriminated against some farmers. And over time, we've had programs that sought to deal with that, in particular, to provide a bit of a preference in some respects for people who've been subjected to discrimination. And that includes preferences or policy sort of aspects that take into account race and sex. This current administration is quite hostile to those types of programs. They've taken some steps to sort of dismantle them. Last summer, there was a regulation that eliminated so-called SDA programs for some programs, but some of them are created by federal statute, and so that takes an act of Congress. We also know that there have been lawsuits attacking these sorts of programs, and we know that the current administration's Justice Department, it says it intends not to defend USDA programs when that sort of lawsuit is filed. So I think what it's fair to say is that a number of the disaster programs do make some effort to remedy past and present discrimination, and that those programs are under threat right now. Some have been dismantled, and it may happen in an ongoing way. A second thing that is of always something that Flag has tried to focus on because a lot of struggling farmers fit this category is the question of citizenship. And so, in general, and we may mention a couple of exceptions here, it's looking like for all the disaster programs, you either need to be a citizen or a resident alien. And we've worked through this question of like who's in and who's out. And if you have a question about that, feel free to ask us. It's a prickly, complicated question, but as I say, I think we either have or will work through it for all the programs that we're going to discuss. We're not going to talk about it today, except, what I'm saying right now, I think. But in the future, it could be an important, relevant question for people that you work with. All right. Let's get ready to talk about the guide itself. You'll notice that, and in fact, why don't we go to the first page, Lindsay? Lindsay's going to share her screen in a moment. Yay. All right. So a lot of the time when we talk about various things, everybody can see this well enough?
I was gonna say, can you make it a little bit bigger, Lindsay, if you're able to zoom in more? I think it's on the bottom right. There's a magnifying glass with a plus sign. There you go. Thank you.
Ooh, look at that. All right, so I'm just going to mention a few of the things that are here on this sort of beginning page. There is kind of small print because we always try to make this a 3 or a 4 pager, so that meant squeezing things. Um, so it's really important that everybody document things that are happening to them in the middle of a disaster. So it's easy enough now to take pictures, really get a good record of everything that goes down. Um, and it can be important in trying to show that what happened to you really is a disaster. So, you may have a drought, and if you can document what your crops look like as the drought progresses, that's going to make it a lot easier for you to show that what you had was a natural disaster. It wasn't, let's just say, some neighbor spraying pesticides on your crop. It's like it sounds crazy, but you know, documenting what's really going on is important always. When you face an disaster, you really want to contact the agencies that you think may be helpful to you right away. One of the important things with disaster stuff is deadlines. You're going to see in our chart in a second, we try to include all the disaster deadlines that we know about and understand. Some of them are actually weirdly confusing, but it's really important to get moving right away. Um, there's usually an appeal system in these programs we're going to talk about. We're not going to spend any time on it, except to say if you get an answer which is no from some agency, it's possible you can proceed still if you do an appeal. Um, we want we mentioned here again the question of mental health. Always keep that in mind with the people you're working with. One of the things that you'll see here, scam artists will come around in the time that I've worked on disaster stuff. Again, as I said, since 93, one of the commonalities is that there are people trying to take advantage of farmers with describing programs or this or that. And the sort of your basic guide here is the classic, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Um, we want to reiterate, as always, that discrimination in these programs or any other programs is illegal. And if you believe you're treating differently based on race, your sex, other things, that's both wrong and not permitted under law. Who might you talk to in the if you face a disaster? You've got a couple of referrals here. Rafi, who has worked closely with Flag for many, many years on disaster stuff, has a hotline. Farm Aid similarly has worked with Flag for many years, doing many versions of this 3 pages that you're looking at, and also responding to other disasters. And so they have a number to call. Um, Not to put you on the spot, Mary, but did you want to mention, do you want to say anything about Farm Aid's hotline, maybe, or one of the other folks? Probably everybody's pretty familiar on this call, but
Yeah, I'll just say that so FarmAid's hotline, kind of what the description says here is that we are connecting you or farmers that call with folks in their community or someone as close by as possible that can work with them more closely on the details. We are, I guess, what we would call a referral hotline. So we don't necessarily have staff on hand that can help you work through or fill out a disaster application or get access to programs per se, but we can help you understand what programs might be a good option for you and also refer you to folks that are located closer to in your area that you could work more one-on-one with.
Great. All right, let's start with the programs. And I really don't want to discourage you, but this is going to be a lot of information, and we're just going to hit the highlights, a lot of different programs, a lot of different agencies. You can sort of see what we tried to do here with this chart. So on the far left, the first column is the program itself, then the government agency, if relevant, that administers the program. What is available often here is flat money and or cost share or loans. Those are the three things that mainly happen. There's a little bit of a description there in the next column on eligibility. Uh, then whether, how do farmers fit into this? And it's an important question. I mean, with some USDA programs, it's sort of obvious. Oh yeah, we're talking about farmers. But with FEMA, for example, or Small Business Administration, it's actually an important question. Like, how do farmers fit into this puzzle? We try to write something here about the deadlines. Deadlines are extremely important. Don't delay. Please, please, please don't delay. Everybody's overwhelmed. We understand that. But farmers must, try to act quickly because the deadline, some of them will come pretty darn quickly. And then there's a column for other, something else that we thought was important to add in. And so, we're not going to cover every box in this on the guide here. We're just going to talk about some highlights. But when this is finished, this is a reference that you'll have with links to try to help you understand the basics of what programs are out there and how to get to them. So, any questions so far? Any puzzling aspects? Okay, let's go. FEMA. Um, FEMA, the main thing to remember is that FEMA is not in particular for farmers, and it's for these sort of catastrophic, devastating natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, things like that. And the benefits here are going to largely help people replace their personal property. It's like if your house is flooded, that's where FEMA is going to be of assistance, and they can help provide you with a place to live you need, or help with repairs for your where you live. We don't have it in the notes here, but this is real money. Um, the, the the current administration seems not to have posted the maximums for the last fall. They should have every year, basically, the amount available for these individual and household program financial resources, FEMA money, basically goes up a little bit due to inflation. And so it's a lot of money. It's for the household items, it's a maximum of $43,000. And for housing money, it's also a maximum of 43. It's probably actually a little bit more than that now. So it's real money, although this is really designed for people who've just experienced an incredible wipeout. Their house is knocked down or it's flooded. It's not to say you couldn't get some assistance for smaller sets of damages, but and it's not like it's going to replace your house, but it makes a huge difference for people who are able to receive this sort of money. Moving on to disaster unemployment assistance, which is one of the weirdest programs that I've ever learned about or described in all the time I've been at Flag. Disaster unemployment assistance is funded by FEMA. The regulations, if you look them up, are in the Department of Labor, and then it's implemented by state and tribal unemployment agencies. So the money comes from FEMA. There's some rules from Department of Labor, but really for most folks, it's gonna be the tribe or the state unemployment agency. And I think as the years go by, these unemployment departments are somewhat more aware of disaster unemployment, and in particular of the eligibility of farmers for it. Um, it's it's fair to say it's counterintuitive. The unemployment agencies don't necessarily understand that this is part of their job. But basically, if you have a natural disaster and you're unable to work, you are unemployed, self-employed. And that includes being a farmer. And it doesn't sound like a big deal, but these checks that come weekly, if you can't, for the time that you can't get out on the farm, it's grocery money and it's real. Again, it's not going to get you out of the effects of disaster, but it's going to help the folks, the families that are hit really hard at the moment and can't do their farm work as a result. The deadline for this comes really rapidly. But I'll say again, it's real money. And sometimes you have to like remind the unemployment departments that farmers are eligible and you need to spread the word. But in my experience, every time we've pushed hard on a state unemployment agency to actually provide farmers with benefits, they have eventually done it, even if they were surprised by the idea to begin with. So moving on, let's jump to some USDA programs. And the first side of them revolve around farm loan programs. So we're DBAN here, so we know that USDA, in particular Farm Service Agency, does a lot of farm lending to farmers that can't get credit elsewhere. It's sort of a core part of what we're learning and working on and doing. What this chart helps you with is thinking through how the various USDA, FSA in this case, agencies can particularly help people in a time of disaster. So the first one we mentioned here is disaster set aside. So that's for people that have a direct loan. So if you have farmers who are already borrowing from USDA, disaster programs at USDA kick in and they can be helpful. So disaster set aside, to summarize, takes your current a 1 year's payment and moves it to the end of your loan. If you're familiar with the others, the regular set aside that exists now, the regular set aside came later. This disaster set aside was there first, and it's sort of the model for the set aside program that we hear much more about. This is eligibility for this is not hard if you get hit by a disaster and you've got a farm loan. The second one here is Emergency Conservation Program, also run by FSA. This is actually one of the really more important programs. It's got kind of a funny name to just call it conservation, but what it really does is provide support, financial support for cleanup costs from a disaster. It's a cost share program. You really have to be careful to document what you're doing. You've got a pretty short deadline to get in and apply. Um, but it's very helpful if you have debris all over the place, whether you're hiring people to do it or you're doing it yourself, there is real money in this program. And it's, to my knowledge, in recent years, always been funded. You sometimes have had cases where there isn't much funding for a program. ECP is important because there is significant money there. The money flows through. I mean, no program is flawless. But I think for people, let's say, that experience a flood, ECP is really, really important. The sort of link to conservation is that the work that you do has to have sort of a conservation purpose. But that's a lot of things on a farm. If you got a fence that's washed out, that's going to help with conservation regarding where animals graze, things like that. So the next one, Emergency Forest Restoration Program, is a little bit more obscure. It's about restoring forests after a disaster. You don't hear very much about it. I think it's always been, of late funded as a cost share to help you do that. You can look at the rules here, but when people have forest damage, that's a helpful one. The next topic has the funny name of Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish Program, ELAP. This is sort of a catch-all that was created by you. Nobody wrote this down and said that admitted this, but my sense is they wrote a program for people that were seemed to be left out of the other programs, some of which we'll talk about. So ELAP, it's great to have it. It's payments to help you if you've had losses resulting from adverse weather. And here's an example for we might just mention where the adverse weather causes a disease problems, and then a disease does kick in. Um, so it's helpful for livestock and other miscellaneous folks too. Livestock largely was left out of disaster programs for a long time. This is one way that is remedied. The next program is one of the most obscure ones, Emergency Livestock Relief Program. And that's uh, in Lindsay's hands.
Thank you. I lost my mute button. Yes, so the Emergency Livestock Relief Program, I think one of the things I'm just going to initially say about this is so far the programs that Stephen has mentioned have been around and kind of continue to be around, right? So if a disaster happened a couple of years ago, you might be eligible for it. If a disaster happens now or next year, most likely these programs will exist. FSA also has historically and presently several programs that they create sort of in response to specific disasters. And sometimes those programs end up being continual, and sometimes they are pretty limited to the time period that in which they were created. And so the reason we decided to keep the Emergency Livestock Relief Program in here, the deadline actually passed, but it was fairly recent. So it was November 21st of last year. But this program kind of has two tracks. So really the goal is to assist livestock producers specifically who either suffered a grazing loss, and that could be from a drought or a wildfire. And keep in mind that these disasters we're talking about have to have occurred in 2023 or 2024. So grazing losses from droughts or wildfire are one track under this program. And then there's a separate track for farmers who have endured additional feed costs because of flooding or wildfires, also in 2023 and 2024. So this is a pretty narrow program. The application process and the types of documentation you need are different depending on whether you suffered a grazing loss or a feed loss. But I think it's important, especially for those folks on this call, because we are, advocates for farmers. And given how recent that the application deadline for this program was, if there are appeals or things like that, or questions that come up, I think it's still important to be aware that the program is out there. And there's actually an additional deadline for supplemental documentation that's not until November of this coming year. So it's definitely still in play, but again, just a pretty narrow set of losses that we're looking at, and from 2023 and 2024. And I think that's what I've got for ELRP, Stephen.
Excellent. So we move now back for a few moments to a loan program. And so emergency loans are an FSA loan program, and you're eligible to get a loan based on physical losses that you had, that the disaster, like destroyed some of your equipment, or production losses. So that this could be a drought that prevents, harms your crops. One thing to point out, and it's just sort of an obvious thing, is there is always the argument when you talk to people that are facing disasters, they will say to you, the last thing I need is another loan. And that's certainly true for a lot of people. However, for some folks, loans make sense. And so if you have face a disaster, the emergency loan program lends they depending on the year, they lend out a lot of money. Now weirdly, the federal statute sets the interest rate, which I think is 4%. I don't think we wrote it down. And so there have been years when the interest rate for a regular FSA loan was less than an emergency loan, but there also have been years where the emergency loan interest rate was lower. And so it was so if you had a disaster, it was appealing to get an emergency loan as opposed to an everyday FSA loan. And as we know from our discussions in the past, in DBAN settings, that FSA loans have pretty good terms. It can be a headache with the paperwork, but if you need credit and you're not able to get your loan from the normal sources, FSA loans can be super helpful. And here's one that specifically aims at helping you get a loan if you've experienced a disaster. And with that, let's move on to farm storage loan facilities. And one often hears the saying that a certain person wrote the book about a topic. Lindsay wrote the book about the farm storage loan facility program. How long was that book, Lindsay? What was it again?
Unclear, but it was now 7 years ago. So we're going to assume some things have changed over time with that one. But yes, FLAG does have a guide to the FSFL program from 2019. And this program is not specifically a disaster program, but I think given sort of the needs that often arise following disasters, it's a useful one to be aware of. Essentially, the FSFL program gives low interest loans for people to either build new or kind of upgrade either permanent or portable storage facilities. And another, important thing to recognize about this program is you don't have to be the landowner, right? You can be a renter who is farming land, and you can still apply and be eligible for this type of loan. In recent years, they added a microloan. So the traditional FSFL loan had a maximum of $500,000, and the down payment would be anywhere between 15 and 20%. But there are also microloans available, and those are up to 50,000, and the down payment is much lower. It's only 5%. So again, this is not tied to a disaster. You don't need to have a presidential declaration. You don't need to show anything about a disaster, but it can be useful as people are recovering from disasters to know that this program is out there.
Great. Let's move on then to a couple of programs that are for livestock folks. You remember that above we talked about ELAP and its role with livestock. ELAP focuses on the loss of your grazing, and that's going to be different from what we're going to talk about right now. So if you lose forage, that's where you go due to a disaster. That's where you go for ELAP. The next two programs are also for livestock, but each of them has a different twist. So the Livestock Forage Disaster Program, or LFP, is for forage, for drought or fire, but it's only for people who are grazing federally managed land. So out west, there is a lot of land which is owned by the federal government and leased to ranchers. And So whereas, say, in the Midwest or the Northeast, not a lot of the countryside is owned by the federal government. Out west, it is an enormous quantity of land. And so if you have a drought, um, yeah, fire or a drought on grazing land that you leased from the government, this that is what the LFP program is designed for. The next program, which with the great name, or at least acronym, Livestock Indemnity Program, LIP, it's always great. Have you thought about the LIP program? Is good for a select group of people. That is to say, again, it's livestock, which is good because, as we noted, a lot of livestock folks have been excluded from these programs. But it makes direct payments, but it's for folks whose livestock were killed or injured by the disaster. So it's sort of a grim one, but when you have floods, fires, things happen that actually kills or really harms your livestock, LIP provides support for those farmers. A couple of these livestock programs, have depends on when the disaster occurs, but in general, you have a longer period. You have until March 1st of next year to apply. So that's the sort of thing that's in the column, for deadlines. I mean, some of them are fast, some of them not so fast, but it's really always important to check. Lindsay, milk loss.
Okay, so the milk loss program, this is another one where the deadline recently passed, but it was very recent. So the sign up opened for this program in November and just ended on January 23rd of this year. So again, I think it's just important to be aware, especially if you get questions or if there's concerns about how FSA handles the programs. But the milk loss program provides payments to dairy operations for milk that people had to dump because of a qualifying weather event. So these don't have to be declared natural disasters, but there's a whole list of what qualifies. And those weather events have to have occurred in 2023 or 2024. So again, a narrower program. I think I often wonder with some of these, will they resurrect them in another couple of years if the circumstances seem appropriate? And who knows? I think that happened with WHIP for those of you who were familiar with the hurricane program, that they had a couple iterations. So who knows if the milk loss program will be one and done or if we'll see a variation of this again. But for now, it's limited to 2023 and 2024 losses. And the sign up just recently passed this year.
We move on to non-insured crop assistance program. That program, often called NAP, requires a little bit of explanation for it to make sense. We mentioned, but haven't really discussed in detail, crop insurance. And crop insurance has been an incredibly useful tool for certain types of farmers. It has always been very difficult to use if you had a diversified farm operation. So if you did specialty crops especially people like who sold at farmers markets who have and say we're urban farmers who had sometimes 12 different things that they were raising. And crop insurance essentially, I mean, you can say this too strongly, but essentially would have required you to have a different policy for each one of these. So there was a long time where organizations, some of whom sort of in our world of organizations that we're familiar with, really pushed hard for USDA to do something like crop insurance, but for people who had diversified farm operations. And NAP is the result of that advocacy. And so you don't want to criticize it too much because at least it's there. But the basic outline of NAP is it's something you have to sign up for in advance. It's generally not super costly, but there's a lot of paperwork involved. But if you sign up and you go through the rigmarole that USDA has for NAP, then you have a natural disaster, you do get payments. And so it's an actual functioning program. It can work. I think the consensus is it's too much of a headache, but and you can't do this sort of after the fact. You can't say, "Oh, I think I'll try to sign up for NAP." You've got to do it at the beginning of your year. And so a fair bit of money goes through NAP, and for people that can can use it, it's a very helpful thing. And in particular for folks that really don't fit into the crop insurance world. So NAP's now kind of long-standing. It's a little more solidified, but more complicated than it needs to be. I think the handbook for NAP benefits is like 400 pages long. I mean, it's like you're kidding, like what? But it's there, and I know Flag has helped especially in the Twin Cities. Uh, we've had we've done a lot of work trying to help people use it. Next up are two interesting programs that Lindsay is going to discuss.
Okay, so next we have the on-farm stored commodity loss program. This, once again, is one that is more narrow in scope. The application deadline for this program was also in January of this year, January 23rd. Essentially, this program, there was $5 million set aside to provide payments to farmers who lost commodities that typically, when they store them on their farm, the commodities last for an extended period of time, but due to a natural disaster, they lost the commodities. So I think two important things to note. One is the natural disaster had to have occurred in 2023 or 2024. And then again, the application deadline has passed, but I imagine people have not yet been informed if they are eligible or not. So this is a program that still could come up for those of you who work with farmers on appeals or things like that, or questions of eligibility. So I would keep that in mind. The next program is the Supplemental Disaster Relief Program, SDRP. And this program is aimed at those who produce trees, bushes, or vines, and that have either a revenue or a quality loss due to disasters in 2023 or 2024. And this program, similar to a couple of them, has sort of different tracks depending on the specific loss that a farmer producer suffers. So if in this case, for farmers who have crop insurance, or if they had, and I think there's a typo there, NAP insurance, the deadline to apply for assistance for a payment is April 30th of this year, so it is still in play. That same deadline exists, but there are separate requirements for farmers who either did not have insurance or otherwise were uncovered for losses, and also for any farmers where the loss is a quality loss and not just a complete production loss. So again, that one has two different tracks, but the application deadline is a couple of months away. And the last thing I will say on this one is that if a farmer fits the eligibility requirements for both tracks, they can absolutely apply for both and receive a payment under both. And I think next up we have the Tree Assistance Program.
The Tree Assistance Program, often called TAP, is the answer to the question that you might have had where you were sitting here listening to these programs and you're thinking, hey, what about people that have trees or vines and get an annual crop from that? Aren't they left out? And the answer is they would be were it not for TAP. So TAP is a cost share program that helps you replant or rehabilitate trees, bushes, and vines that have been damaged by the disaster and are no longer viable. And so it needs to be that you have something that that has an annual crop So it's not like the forest is different. This is, let's say you have vines and you harvest grapes and sell them every year. Um, TAP is designed for those folks. It's can have a pretty short deadline. It's 90 days from the event, or I think it's when you knew or when or should have known. I can't remember. Became apparent to the farmer. Yeah, one of those ambiguities to the regulation. But at any rate, it can be a pretty quick deadline. So if this is something that happens to someone you're working with, they need to kind of get on the ball and go to USDA and apply for their TAP assistance. Next, we shift gears and move to the Small Business Association administration. And it's worth pointing out that SBA has had a bit of a troubled history with agriculture for a long time. Historically, SBA sort of thought kind of no matter what, if you're a farmer, their programs were not available to you. And that has changed somewhat over the years. I mean, you can see when you look at these programs that it's still not really set up for farmers, but it turns out, that more recently that the SBA programs can be of some benefit for farmers in a way that they may not have been in the past. So here we talking again about loans, loans. If you need them, you need them. If you would love to stay away from a loan, but sometimes it is the right thing for your operation. So you've got a couple of different kinds of loans here. One is when you've had physical damage from the disaster. So that can be your equipment, even your real estate. But you'll notice, and we wrote in here, it's not for agricultural enterprises. What's an agricultural enterprise? I mean, I think in general, what it's is fair to say that if it's to the extent it's completely value added um, as a business, then that's going to get you in the ballpark for an SBA loan. Whereas, if the farm crop loss, the SBA physical disaster loan is not going to be super helpful. The economic injury disaster loans look more at, okay, you've had a disaster. What are the sort of economic effects of the disaster on your business? Actually, these provide for farm eligibility. I think that was not always the case. I'm not remembering when it shifted over, but it is available now. There seem to be pretty decent terms for these loans. So if you end up unable to, say, get an emergency loan with FSA, maybe this is something that people could look at because farm stuff is actually eligible. We move now to an important program which you don't normally, you wouldn't think of as involving disaster, and that's EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. This is an NRCS program. A lot of money rolls through EQIP. It's a really valuable program for conservation practices. And you get cost share assistance and also technical assistance. It needs what you're trying to do needs to be connected to conservation, and it's open year round. There are no deadlines. But if you and it's not like you have to have a disaster to do this program, but if you do have a disaster, what NRCS is good about is letting you deal with your disaster through their program, EQIP, which was not necessarily designed for disasters, if that makes sense. So if you're doing repairing erosion or repairing fencing, these are the sorts of things that EQIP is designed to do, stop, limit erosion. It just so happens for this, the reason you have an erosion problem is a disaster. So a fair number of people end up using EQIP as they try to recover from a disaster, even though that's not sort of the main way that the program was designed. So any questions? We're sort of through the not short list of particular programs. Um, There are a handful of other things that we wanted to discuss too. Um, no questions? It's numbing, I know. Um, but that's okay. These programs are important. So we want to talk about what was it? Four more things? Yes, four more, and we'll get close to a wrap. Um, the first one is one that you wouldn't necessarily want to think about in times of a disaster, but it's actually important, and that is bankruptcy. And there's very little about bankruptcy that is directly connected to disaster. It's obviously not just for people who have a disaster, but the reality is if people are very severely harmed by the effects of a natural disaster and aren't able to use the programs to sort of get themselves out of a hole, there are going to be people that can reasonably think about uh, bankruptcy as a way to go forward. And DBAN, and in other contexts, has a much more detailed discussion of bankruptcy. And I think, time will tell, but we're going to do more debtor creditor type of stuff. And we've already done some. So um, I just think as an issue spotting thing, if you deal with folks that are having severe financial crisis due to disaster, of course, the disaster programs come into play, but also you need to think more broadly about what sort of things are available. And that's gonna, um, for some people, include bankruptcy. And not to go into too much detail, but your classic person who could really benefit from bankruptcy is going to be somebody who has a lot of unsecured debt, debt for which there is no collateral, or debt which in bankruptcy terms is under collateralized. Let's say you borrowed $100 and you have you offered collateral for that, but the collateral is only worth 40. So even if somebody takes your collateral, you're still going to owe them a big chunk of money. It's as if it's unsecured debt. So those are the two classic cases for, I mean, just speaking super generally, people with unsecured debt or undersecured debt are often going to be the people who are most able to benefit from bankruptcy. But again, that's really sort of another day, another topic. One of the sort of odd but interesting way, not interesting at all, but actually odd ways that um, that has ramifications in the wake of a disaster is your federal income tax. And so it sort of goes without saying, if you have a disaster and it reduces your crop yields and the things that you can sell, okay, that affects your income and that affects your income taxes. Well, and that's the obvious part. The less obvious part is that you can get deductions, and we're gonna keep this pretty simple, but they are casualty losses. So um, if you have effects of a disaster that affect your farm property, it's possible to have certain kinds of losses which can count as deductions. And here, as is always the case, I think, at least when I'm talking about farm taxes, I actually find the IRS's Farmer's Tax Guide to be super helpful. So we have a link for it here. It's IRS publication 225. Um, anytime you have a tax issue and you're working with a farmer, it's worth looking at this guide, actually. I think it's one of the best things out there along these lines. For people who do have a disaster, and this is discussed in the IRS guide, there are actually some sort of tricky things that can help. So and I think the lesson here is if you have somebody who's in a disaster situation and it comes time to do taxes, they or their tax preparer needs to be aware of some very specialized things in the tax code for farmers who have had a disaster. And one of them is, let's say because of a drought, you can't you have to sell some cattle early because you don't have anything to feed them. And that can affect your taxes in the sense that if you sell your cattle in, let's say, 2025 instead of 2026, because of the disaster, you have to pay taxes on those sale of that cattle earlier than you would have. And time matters, like the reality is the more you can delay paying your taxes in general, the better it is. And so what the tax code says is that if you had to sell something early because of a natural disaster, you can actually delay reporting that on your taxable income for a year. So if normally you would have sold your cattle in February of 2026, but instead you sold them in the fall of 2025 because of a drought, you can report that income from that sale not on your 2025 tax forms, but your 2026. So, in a lot of ways, taxes is all about timing. And for various reasons, it's good to be able to have control over or when you report stuff. And so it's a provision that's, I, I, I won't say it's a secret or anything, but it's one that often gets missed. Um, then there are other things in the code that we just won't spend time on. But if you're affected by a drought, there are certain little other things that can help you. So the short point is that with your federal income taxes are include more consideration of disaster than you might suppose. So people that you work with need to be paying attention to that. Two more topics. One is private insurance. And here we're talking about the sort of catastrophic disasters like floods and hurricanes. Lots of people, farmers and non-farmers, have insurance for their home and for other buildings. Um, and it just kind of goes without saying that that's a big industry. They pay out a lot of money and also resist paying out a lot of money. And so the thing to remember from a legal point of view is your policy is what controls here. And so people shouldn't be shy about insisting that their insurance coverage pays them all that it should. And so there's a lot of a back and forth that goes on in insurance indemnities. If you have a lot at stake here, it may make sense to try to get some assistance, be it a lawyer or somebody else. Um, but it's something that's going to be come into focus, right away because people are going to think, oh, I've got insurance. But the tricky part is what does the insurance actually cover? And, let's say it's a fire. Well, is the fire caused by the flood? Maybe. If so, maybe a flood insurance provision covers you. I mean, these are the sort of complicated questions that can arise with private insurance. Um, it's really important to document, as we've said before, for insurance, important to be aware of what they're doing and what they're thinking. Um, and it's one of these things where it can be a tug of war, but the stakes can be pretty high. Our last topic is federal crop insurance. Um, Federal crop insurance is, if you want to benefit from crop insurance, you need to buy it in advance. There are private providers. You don't buy crop insurance from USDA. You buy it from private providers. And, weirdly, there are not that many private providers that sell crop insurance across the country. I think it's like 13 or 11. And because of regulation, the policies are very similar one to another. And so the trick is to buy crop insurance, which is useful for you and for your operation. It's worth noting that at least 60% of the actual cost of crop insurance is paid for by the federal government. So crop insurance is actually kind of a backdoor subsidy for certain farmers. Crop insurance always pays out more nationally in total than farmers paid in to buy the crop insurance. So, I mean, my suggestion to people is always, if you think that crop insurance won't help you, it's probably worth a second look just to see. Because once you do have a drought or once you do have flooding, which affects your yields, it's too late to sign up. Um, and not everybody's had positive experiences with crop insurance, but um, it pays out billions every year based on natural disasters of some sort or another. And but you've got to be signed up and paid for and follow their rules top to bottom. Um, so it's always worth thinking about, but it's you got to do it on time. That is a summary of the draft, soon to be complete, scintillating uh, guide to disaster assistance. Um, Somebody has a question, maybe.
I have a question. Um, Hi, thank you, Stephen and Lindsay, for the presentation. Um, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about disaster declarations and the way that they intersect with the programs. I know it's different from program to program, but if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So for many of the programs that we discussed, a disaster declaration is required. And what that means, I mean, well, if you are super curious about this, I could point you to some things that are pretty good explanations, although it's surprisingly complicated. These declarations are by geographic area for certain events. So if you have a drought at a certain point, you'll get there would be a disaster declaration for a particular county for drought. And so there are so-called presidential declarations. There are secretary declarations by the Secretary of Agriculture. Um, what was the one you mentioned, Lindsay? I'd kind of forgotten. There was one that didn't even require a disaster declaration. Um, I can't remember.
That was just the farm storage facility
Yeah,
loan.
okay. So, but at any rate, for a lot of things, you do need a declaration, and that's safe for FSA emergency loans. The eligibility starts with a declaration and goes for 8 months after that. So the declaration kind of creates the opportunity to use the program as well in some cases as helping to create the deadline. So, now we have a little bit better system of knowing just because, I mean, I hate to admit something good about the internet, but at least it allows you to know pretty readily when there are disaster declarations. At Flag, we used to, this is not funny, but we used to look at the Federal Register because that's where they appeared. And then we would forward on the information to people about where disaster declarations had occurred and for what purpose. So, but now it's pretty easy to figure that out. And it has some weird effects. I mean, sometimes the declaration will be for the next county over, but not your county, and farmers will go, "Hey, why?" I mean, we got hit too. And in those instances, congressional delegations can come into play, and these inevitably are often sort of political decisions. So people should be aware that the lack of a declaration is not like ironclad. So
And I
does
think
that?
that I
Yeah,
was
go.
just going to say, Stephen, that last piece I think is pretty important and where the language, and we might try to be sure we hone that when we finalize this. But sometimes the programs will say qualifying weather event, which often I think um, means it doesn't have to be necessarily a declared disaster. And so I think I'm making a note to just go through and be sure that we're consistent in the language we use. But that's also where it's just important to check the program requirements specifically, because not all of them are going to require that declaration. And then some programs also will say, as Stephen was saying, if you're in or contiguous to, right? So they just all have different nuances to who's eligible, and which, makes it so much easier for us. But I think to that point, I was also just wanted to make sure everyone knows, and particularly for the FSA programs, that I would say for probably 90% of the ones that are on this guide, there are really extensive handbooks online that detail everything about eligibility and the application process, and if there's any prohibition on receiving duplicative assistance. I think that's one thing we didn't talk about as much, but some programs say, if you got a payment for a flood loss, from another disaster program, you're not eligible to receive a payment for the same type of loss, right? So there are these handbooks for most of the programs, and they can be useful if you're working with a farmer and if there's pretty technical or specific questions that they have, because they're very detailed. And I know Stephen and I and anyone at Flag would also be helpful if you get those kinds of questions to navigate through the handbooks with you as well.
Because Lindsay likes looking at handbooks, as we all do.
I was curious if you all could talk a little bit more about the documentation, or like, I know that you all mentioned that at the beginning of sort of like making sure that that farmers have that. Can you talk just a little bit more about like what are some examples of like good record keeping or documentation that might help farmers whenever they're submitting disaster assistance applications?
Well, you start with photograph for this sort of catastrophic type of disasters. You start with photographs or videos and get images of everything. Um, but it can go beyond that. I mean, I know people have had disputes with agencies over like when a weather thing hit, where the agency says, no, this couldn't have, hurt you. It hadn't happened yet, or something like that. And in those instances where people do have really good records of, when something hit, that can make a big difference. So, and it also means that, for example, you'll notice that a lot of the programs are cost share. So the agencies have rules about what you can be reimbursed for and what you can't be reimbursed for. Sometimes if you use your own labor, you can still get money for that, but you have to suit them. You have to meet what they want for the record keeping for cost share. So it kind of goes without saying, keep every receipt, but actually keep everything about every effort you make in those cost share circumstances. And, if it's my suggestion would be, I mean, you probably sign something which set out the rules, but really push hard to make sure you understand what sort of documentation they're going to want for a cost share. Or, I mean, and so like when we said, if one of the drought program, that like the tax program where you sold early, you're going to need records, that show, all right, these were young animals. We normally sell in February or March. We sold them early. This is what we got for them. It was a terrible price, and we sold them early. So you reconstructing all of that would, I think, go into record keeping. But boy, really with the cost share stuff, I mean, you're trying to convince this agency that you have a legitimate expense. So your record keeping is really important.
And I think I would just add to it that it's not just the record keeping right following a disaster, because many of these programs, it's a comparison, right? If you had a revenue loss, if you had a production loss. And so that requires showing, what it was previously. So just generally good record keeping is going to be important and useful for many of these programs as well, not just after the disaster hits.
All right. Go DBAN.
Do folks have any other lingering questions that they want to ask?
Yeah, I have another question. Um, I never thought about this before, but you were talking about there being 13 providers or something for crop insurance. And I know those are all federal crop insurance, not managed by private companies. But is there such a thing as just like totally private crop insurance?
Such a
Is
thing
that
as what?
like just not associated with the federal government crop insurance? I'd never considered that,
Well,
but
you could, but you would be very hard to compete because of the federal subsidy. So if you don't take part in the federal subsidy, it'd be a bit of a puzzle how you can make money doing it.
hmm that
I
makes sense.
don't know how I'm not aware. I mean, maybe somebody else is aware of some there probably somewhere in America is some sort of specialized insurance that's not federal crop insurance
hmm
provided. There's got to be, but I'm just not super aware of it.
I can see that it doesn't seem like a very appetizing business model considering the federal crop insurance program, but I just thought I'd ask.
I know, but I have to say this is gratuitous point. If I wanted to get rich, I would start selling crop insurance. I mean, you're just almost guaranteed to make a bit of money. Neither here nor there.
Hey, I have a question. These are there's a beautiful table, and thanks for all the explanation. I mean, it's wonderful to have it all under one in one place. But it's also too much for us to like, as you mentioned, Stephen, too much for us to take it in at one go. And also not knowing, and Stephen mentioned that there's like a lot of a handbook for every program, which is kind of a lot to go through. But if there's a place and a time, like a place where we want to connect, just to make sure, like if we come to know of a farmer and kind of know what they're going through, and we think these three may be possible, like, maybe these programs apply to them, where could we connect and kind of confirm? Like, would we go to Flag, Farm Aid? How do we kind of get that help?
Good question. Um, I think if you have a des if like if you we'll soon have a final version of this like three pager. So I would hope that you would take a quick look at it and see kind of how things seem to line up. Um, and then if you're confused, like call it, send us an email or something.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Is it okay if I share your email, Stephen and Lindsay, with?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Lindsay's too. There we go. Yeah. We usually do this. Yeah, there we go. We usually do that, but we forgot. And we will have this guide finished soonish. And it's hard to imagine. The long thing I'll say about the guide, you'd think it would be easier to do it shorter. No, it's really hard to like condense things in a useful way.
And I will just for any of you, if you're sitting there thinking they forgot, X, Y, or Z program, feel free to let us know that too. If something comes to mind that we didn't address that you think would be useful to include in the guide, we are all ears. So,
Yeah, it's actually from farmers and farm groups that I came to understand how much equip was used for disaster stuff. I was largely unaware. So feedback is a crucial piece for us being able to do our thing.
Any last questions before we wrap up, everybody?
Thank you, interpreters. Philippe, Angeline, we appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Felipe
Felipe,
and
sorry,
Angie.
Felipe.
And thank you also, Stephen and Lindsay, for a riveting no, I'm just a very informative presentation and lots of good resources. Yes, we will definitely share out the completed guide soon once Stephen and Lindsay make a few more edits. And I think it will be a helpful resource for folks that are working with farmers, hopefully. And just to reiterate what Stephen said at the beginning, it's not that we expect any of us to memorize this information, but to have some sense of what programs might be available and at least have the links and references where you can go and like learn more about it and be able to understand the programs more to see if the farmers that you're working with qualify and how you might be able to help them get some assistance. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and we'll see you again soon. Bye. Thanks, everybody.